I'm Dr. Duke, joined today by Sandra Stotsky, one of the country's foremost experts in English language arts education. Sandy has been an absolute pioneer, a huge force trying to push back against Common Core. She wrote the Massachusetts state standards, which were really the gold standard in this country prior to Common Core, and so she's still busy trying to right the wrongs of the big federal takeover of education. Sandy, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me for this conversation.
We have a couple of articles that you're very prolific. When you're not writing books, you're writing articles. We've got a couple of articles we want to share with the audience. One that you wrote called How to Clean Up the Common Core Mess in Massachusetts. That's the New Boston Post. That's an important one, by the way, because if you can clean up what's wrong in Massachusetts, you will be able to do it in the rest of the country. And then the Idaho Freedom Foundation, another article. Here's how Idaho can develop academically strong ELA and mathematics standards when it revises its current standards. Idaho is one of the few states that seems to be taking seriously Common Core reform. So it's good to see that you're helping them as well. And we've got some questions we wanted to ask you based on these articles, Sandy. So start off with this one. Why? Why has federal money, all that federal money spent since 1965 on education, why hasn't it helped low-income minorities?
That is a $64 question that hasn't been answered by any of our researchers. One of my first answers is that they didn't look at the essential findings of both the Coleman report in 1966 and the Moynihan report in 1965.
So the main reason is that they're just not paying attention to their data, which is hardly surprising at the federal level. Number two, why has federal money since 1965 been targeted to the areas of influence on school achievement found in both of those documents? Why are they, in your mind, not retargeting that money the right way?
They targeted the money because under President Lyndon B. Johnson and his war on poverty, we had ESEA, Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and that steered everybody to thinking that it was education that needed to be intervened with and fixed up because black children, and at that time they were concerned in Congress and in LBJ's eyes with Indian reservation children as well, because they were at the bottom of the academic heap, so to speak. They were doing poorly, and part of the issue was to figure out how to get federal money. This was the first piece of federal money that was targeted to low-income communities.
And so this started, of course, a trend, obviously. This is one more thing that we can question the constitutionality of it, all right? The federal government now beginning to fund education, even though trying to get to this particular community might have been a useful thing. So one more quick follow-up on this in the 1960s. Who triggered this? Do you know where these two reports that were put out there, why did you think they didn't move the needle? I mean, why, if the federal government was genuinely trying to help this particular poor community, why were the reports themselves ignored?
They weren't totally ignored. It was just that their main finding was that, and they both concluded this, and both Moynihan and Coleman were distinguished sociologists, and lots of people had seen these reports. They weren't totally ignored, but they both concluded that family background weighed more heavily than did schools and teachers. And so they decided, whoever was in charge of the federal money at that time, or helping LBJ decide upon his priorities, and that much politically I haven't been able to figure out, but the decision was made that it would be education that would be targeted, even though both of these very eminent sociologists had both found that what was done with reference to family background was far more important in the formulas that they were using or in the analyses that they were conducting on factors affecting school achievement. That the schools were less important, and that what we needed to pay attention to was family background. But maybe there were some concerns about how they would actually do anything about family background. I don't know the thinking that went on in 1965, 66, or in the years after that.
Well, it's been 50 years, and you've been constantly beating this drum that it's much more important for the families to put their weight behind their discipline, getting the kids motivated, having a positive attitude towards education in the family home itself. No one's listening to this. I mean, in fact, we've gone exactly the other way. It's one thing to ignore Moynihan and Coleman, but we have 50 years now that seem to suggest this is exactly the wrong way of handling it, allowing teachers to usurp more and more of the parental responsibility, cutting parents out altogether, telling parents under the Common Core regime, we don't want your input, stay out of it. It gets worse and worse. Why are our public schools unable to adapt to 50 years of failure?
I'm not sure that I put the blame on the public schools, which wanted federal money. They were eager to get the additional money from the feds because they had been totally dependent upon typically local property tax money and some state money, maybe about half and half. 45% of their total budgets came from both local property taxes and from state taxes, which would come from the communities in a state. Less than 10% all along has come from the federal government, even once it passed ESEA, which was in 1965 or 1966. The groundwork was being prepared. But there were a lot of educators, and I don't know that we had a huge constituency for people interested in family background and what could be done. There were a lot of people who thought that they knew what could be done in education. And over the past 50 years, they've tried, and nothing has worked as a silver bullet to change what happened. The curriculum was left out.
Why is it that school choice may actually be very useful to promote to try to address some of these issues?
School choice to parents could be helpful if parents are informed enough, and if the school choice lets the schools or the parents have some input into what is in the curriculum. What do parents complain about today? They want more input into what is taught to their children. What do they read? What do they write about? That's what parents would like to have input in. And they've been almost totally frozen out, whereas other people have somehow claimed that they knew better than low-income parents what would make these low-income children of low-income parents do better. We have to remember that children aren't poor, it's their families that are poor, but ultimately the parent is in charge of the child's education, and that seems to have been something that our educators and researchers and others, policymakers in education, have decided should be directed by bureaucrats, as I see it, who basically don't know as much about what should happen in a classroom as the child's teachers, who I would not particularly fault because their concern was to get better pay for better working conditions, which is still a concern of teachers. So I don't blame teachers. It's the people directing where federal money should be spent. And they, for some reason, decided that it should be better spent on educational interventions, even though they couldn't find any educational interventions that really worked across the board. Maybe it's a total misconception of how one improves the academic achievement of a huge number of low-achieving adolescents, which was the essential problem.
Follow that up. How and why is portability for individual students a possible help here? Explain what portability is, and why would that be a helpful thing?
Portability, as I understand the word as it's used today, means that the federal government will target some amount of money per student. Whether it gives more money for lower income children in their poor families or not, I'm not sure. There are some issues that would have to be resolved, but portability means the money is attached not to a local school district, which decides what its school budget will be, but goes according to the child that is in the school system. And if the child then is placed in a private school, which a lot of people would now like to see as part of school choice, then the money would be directed to whatever that private school is. The money doesn't go to the parents. It is based on the child's needs, so that a disabled child might get more money under portability than a child that's not disabled. But those details I haven't seen worked out. They would require public discussion and input. That is part of the problem. Portability could answer part of the problem because it would be responsive to what a parent wants for a parent's own children. We assume that they have the interest of their own children closer to their heart than a bureaucrat or an educator in a local school system would. But then the problem is, are they still under national standards which have been built into how we interpret the last reauthorization of ESEA? It's been reauthorized maybe 5 times since 1965. And the last reauthorization was the last month of Obama's administration. And ESSA, ESSA, Every Student Shall Succeed Act, which was it succeeded the No Child Left Behind version of ESEA. Sorry to use so many acronyms, but that's how these huge bills get identified. But the problem then is, what do we do with children in these schools? Do they have to follow and use the same standards, tests, and textbooks that are used in the public schools, assuming that they're no longer called public, or that they could be a mix of private and public charters, which would make them governed differently than a local public school, which has a school committee an elected body doing something. That's where there are some messy issues that have not been resolved, because the portability issue hasn't been resolved itself. There are people who don't want the money going with the child. They want the money being directed where they think it can be most, quotes, accountable from the federal government's perspective. And that isn't the way it happens. I think that portability, if it is responsible to where parents want their kids, if they want them in a parochial school or some other kind of faith-based setting, let them do that. That would be, to me, an example of accountability, where a parent wants their child educated and where they think they're paid attention to, which they generally were in faith-based schools. But I can't say more than that right now.
Why is the continued use of Common Core aligned standards, textbooks, possibly undoing the benefits of school choice?
Because it is a one-size-fits-all approach, and schools, under the banner of what has been interpreted as accountability, must follow what is in the uniform standards called Common Core, and the tests that are aligned to Common Core, and the textbooks that are aligned to Common Core. In other words, the very idea of uniformity in what are the conditions prevents schools from responding differently to the needs of different children. And there are different needs, and we've had this one-size-fits-all by people who felt that somehow that we needed to have one-size-fits-all to make sure that there was no discrimination or bigotry. that is a different issue, and I'm not going to spend time on that right now, but making sure that everything is equal, meaning one size fits all, has meant that schools could not be responsive to different kinds of needs of different larger groups of children, maybe individuals and maybe groups of them in clusters. It needs a lot of public discussion, which we've never had.
Last quick question for you, Sandy, before I let you go. Talk about civics education. It's a complete mess now. And what would you do to try to bring to this country some consistent and constitutionally based awareness of civic responsibility?
There are several different approaches that could be used to make uniform what we need for civic education. In Massachusetts, we actually had history and geography standards and economic standards that had to be observed in all school systems receiving public tax money for their services as public education. So that is the part that I've tried to focus on. There is a naturalization test, which a lot of people think might be useful, because when we naturalize people for America to become American citizens, there is a 100-item test that could be taught in high school. Locally, we could do things in earlier grades based upon local history, local education, or state history. I have been trying to get states to, even in their literature curriculum, find out who were their state authors, because they could highlight their own states. Students vote in their own states, and people do vote for various different things in different states. But I haven't been able to get one group of teachers or educators to consider state authors, authors who were prominent in their states, in addition to other works of world literature that you might want kids to be exposed to. But I haven't been able to get people to even focus on the state level or the local level, because some of these authors are born or write about many local geographical areas as well. So we have a problem in getting standards that are tailored to the states, even though 45% of the money going to our public schools comes from the state level.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate in thinking about the civics question that this has been highly politicized now. They're not looking back at what actually happened in this country. They're reframing it now with the 1619 curriculum. Black Lives Matter, Planned Parenthood now are having a huge say in terms of the kind of books kids are reading, and what we used to call civics, learning how to live in a constitutional republic, knowing what the rights and responsibilities of liberty were. They're radically being replaced now, it seems, by a much more restrictive, much more ideological set of paradigms that has nothing to do with what we would call traditional liberty. Sandy, I'll give you the last word on that.
We made sure in Massachusetts, and it didn't last long, that there would be an essay test in high school, grade 11 or 12, that would be constitutional period based, so that all students would have to learn what is in the Constitution, what are the basic principles underlying it. I don't know how different groups in this country feel about having a single set of questions that all students should understand, because we've now been told that there is white privilege in looking at just even our Constitution and politically seminal documents, that they do not address all students. But I haven't seen anyone propose what would address all students. Anything else that's been proposed for civic education obviously hasn't produced higher achievement anywhere.
this is a calculated move with regards to civics to keep kids away from the founding values, not because they're white supremacist or because they're somehow oriented in racism, because to understand the history of the country in its actuality makes you recognize that however imperfect the founders were, the documents ultimately guaranteed liberty and freedom for all. That's not what I think many modern educators want. They want a new system. They want to tear down the old one. They want to agitate for some radical new socialist vision of education. And you and I have talked about that before, but let's get together again soon, Sandy. These are enlightening conversations. Thank you for your insightful comments today.